Welcome to the Precision Teaching Podcast. My name is Rick Cabina, and today I'm joined by Doug Kostowitz.
Hello, everybody.
Carrie Millico.
How's it going?
And Sean Datchik.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome back, podcast crew. We haven't convened together where everyone hasn't had something going on in a while.
Holidays,
It's nice to be back.
Yeah, it is really nice to be back and to hear everybody's happy voice being part of the podcast again.
There we go. There's some excitement that I was
Yes.
looking for.
Woo!
High five.
Oh, ow, that hurt.
Let's start our first segment of the show, and that's happenings and happened. And what has happened is IPTC 2013. That IPTC, by the way, is the International Precision Teaching Conference. We held a spectacular conference where Carrie was the main person who helped organize that conference. It was down
under your leadership, Rick.
Well, we'll both take credit for it, but you were the one who really helped make that just an awesome conference. It was held in St. Petersburg, and we had a number of events. What did you all think about the conference?
I thought it was hands down one of the best conferences, whether it's an IPTC conference or any other conference. I thought it was energetic presentations, informative sessions, and the weather did not hurt at that time of year.
I think that was the weekend when a lot of, or right there during or right before the polar vortex, or a lot of people were getting dumped on up north. I think it was the only location that was not snowing.
It definitely wasn't snowing. It was nice to be on the beach.
Definitely.
For those who couldn't attend the conference or are unfamiliar with our conference, we have a interesting way of doing it. We actually had a new format this year where the first day was a single track. We had a number of interesting events, and some of those events I thought went off very well. We had a research panel, which was excellent. We had a debate, which was good. We had presentations from some of the leaders in the precision teaching field.
Yep.
And then the next day we had, before we get to that, we had very good social events. Our chart share went off well. And then the next day we had all the sessions. I couldn't be more pleased with the turnout either.
Yeah, me too. I got great response about the single track day. It was nice to have everyone together, like a cohesive unit, and everyone just kind of being able to attend the same talk. So that way, on the second day, people can incorporate some things that were mentioned in the first day into their presentation, and the attendees would know what they were talking about because they all, made it to that event. I also got some great feedback about and those special events, Rick, that you mentioned, particularly the debate. So it was you and Tim Weil, who's from USF, and you guys were, taking kind of opposing stances or just, representing two different kind of groups in behavior analysis, charters and non-charters. And while Tim, is very accepting and a proponent of the chart, he was kind of taking the stance of those just kind of typical non-charters in our field. And everyone was just loving it. And they, were talking about what their responses would be, or about how they liked one of the responses, and how we need to have that type of event in the future years. They're like, I don't know if it should be a debate, but it should, be kind of like this two-man, not going at each other, but, one person speaks and another person reacts and so forth, type of setup that they were just loving it. So, and all the evaluations kind of supported that as well.
That's a nice segue into the next item, which is the conference, we've set the date for the next Precision Teaching Conference, which is December 11th, 12th, and 13th, and that will be held in Chicago. Let me strongly encourage all of you listeners who have yet to attend the conference to go. Make it your event because, as Carrie was mentioning, we have a very, I feel, probably of all the conferences I go to, one of the most accepting and informative and what are some other adjectives that would...
Encouraging.
Encouraging. That's a wonderful word.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, Rick. You know, with these smaller conferences, you have the ability to learn so much from people during the sessions, but also really outside of the sessions. And because there's only, 100 to 150 people at the conference, there's a great likelihood that you're going to be able to talk to Rick Kubina, Carl Binder, Kent Johnson, all these big names in our field. And, so many of my staff walked away going, oh my God, I can't believe I talked to blah, 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 blah. And it's so true. And so, during that, little 5-minute interaction, you can probe some great questions about your thesis, or if you're a parent about something that's kind of tripping you up with your child. But I mean, it's just such a great opportunity to learn and grow, and everyone's so supportive. That's
a great comment. I was thinking about IPTC last year, 2 years ago. You just sit down and, I'm sitting next to Julia Vargas. And then this year, oh, wow, there's Hank Pennypacker.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
And what's really cool is that we really have some great people in our, who are well respected in behavior analysis, who are well respected in education. It's not, even though we are a small little community, it's just not a bunch of kind of no-namers. There's some really big powerhouses in our group. So it's quite exciting.
The sense of collaboration is always wonderful. So people, if you haven't been to an IPTC, last year's was wonderful. This year we hope to have another great conference. Well, let's move on to our email question. The email question says, "Hi Rick and podcast crew. I'm a homeschooler and would like to know, how can I use PT with my children? Are there materials available? Who published curricula? Thanks for the help. Regan in Atlanta." Well, what do you all think about that? What if you were going to give advice to a homeschooler that wanted to use precision teaching, what would you recommend?
I actually have, I'm the one outsider who's not in academia. So I deal with parents who a lot of times have their kids who are homeschooled. And I have yet to kind of hang my hat on one particular curriculum line. I'm not super knowledgeable in all that is out there for homeschoolers. But what I would look for, some key things that I would look for are a good scope and sequence where you start with the fundamentals first and not one that jumps all around. I would also look for one where there's built-in mastery criteria and one that allows for a lot of practice opportunities. And I think that that's where precision teaching can nicely fit into whatever curricula that you have. Is that, okay, so your child learns a particular, lesson, and that new item that you're talking about that day, you can make practice sheets, and you just want to create a situation where the child can freely respond to various academic stimuli targeting that one new skill of that lesson. And so therefore you're developing higher rates of responding, you're able to provide feedback, all that good stuff. So I think that precision teaching could supplement whatever curriculum you have. I do not know of an entire curriculum sequence that is made for homeschoolers in particular. Although you can also get supplements from, the Morning Side and Elizabeth Houghton. There's some great resources there that you can use in addition to whatever that you're using for kind of scope and sequence to meet the standards.
Well, actually, what I think you hit on a little bit. First thing, with regards to precision teaching, as we always say, if you are measuring something, you can chart it. So if you're whatever you're using, and so when it's more of getting at how to do precision teaching is the first thing, how to do the chart. And there's many resources, both free and you can pay for them. I'm just throwing out, the precision teaching book is one, but there's techniques in there. And that's just, as Carrie mentioned, identifying the specific skills, working on those skills, and then charting them. And that you are then doing precision teaching to some extent, as long as you are counting. But then your other question is then identifying those high need skills, aligning them with that scope and sequence. Mm-hmm. And then whether it's reading, whether it's math, and there are things such as just generally speaking, the direct instruction, direct instruction reading, direct instruction math. Both of those books provide a clear scope and sequence of skills. Then you can make your own sheets if you want to, but there are other sheets available, and then it's just aligning, counting, and determining aims, which are available at the precisionteachingresource.net. Thank you, Rick. And so there's a lot of it's really the beautiful thing here is the freedom to do what you want with regards to it, but it's more importantly what your specific child needs at that time. And then it's identifying those skills within that scope and sequence. So it's not really go buy this and pull it out and use it, because there's acquisition, then there's also the level of fluency and things like that. But giving something like a direct instruction reading and direct instruction math at least can provide some of that. And those are just books. And then you look through there. You can find different teaching formats for things, but then you can also align those skills. So I don't mean to ramble.
And to just support what you were mentioning, Doug, that's a lot of how my Learning Center's curriculum started, is that we purchased some, DI curricula that had a great scope and sequence. We kind of, found areas in which we could create more practice opportunities and edit the scripts a little bit for one-on-one sessions instead of the classroom. And so through just revamping and tweaking here and there, and, including extra steps and maybe eliminating some steps that we thought were redundant, we kind of had a nice supplement to the direct instruction books that we use at our center. So I think I just second whatever you mentioned.
Those are excellent answers. Regan, we are very pleased that you are looking to use precision teaching with your children. And Doug and Carrie think that's a very nice way of explaining how you can incorporate PT and some places where you can follow up. And of course, we have a listserv. If you're on Facebook, you can go on there. We have online chart shares that are done. There's a lot of ways you can access information that doesn't cost money. And of course, talking with us on the podcast, which we appreciate.
Definitely. And also, I don't know if it's Regan or Reagan, but stay tuned to, in a year, some colleagues and I are in the works to plan out a curriculum co-op. So that way, those of us who slave away at creating curriculum, those of you, Reagan, if you're looking for a curriculum, you don't have to reinvent the wheel if it's already been invented. So we'll be making announcements as this kind of project develops, but it's in the infant stages right now.
And once that happens, that will be shared everywhere on this podcast and elsewhere. That's a wonderful resource that you are developing.
Thanks.
Let's move on to our education news. We have a story which appeared in the press, picked it up. This is in USA Today. In the story, talks about the push for full day kindergarten. And I learned some things about after reading this story, but I thought, number one, the push for this has a very interesting logic behind it. The one paragraph says, some research has shown that attendance in full-day kindergarten is linked to higher levels of early reading in a typical newspaper fashion. Then they say, other research, however, suggests the impact is minimal. I mean, every journalist that's just bore into their soul that you just can't say what's right. There always has to be an opposing to this. But the preponderance of evidence that I have seen supports full-day kindergarten and the gains that you can achieve with it.
I don't think there's a question, even at face value, the more practice opportunities kids have in educational settings to do these skills. And I'm not tying this to any particular curriculum. I'm tying this to any. I'm just saying they have more educational opportunities early in their career. Those gains will be felt over time for these kids.
Yep.
And I think having some kind of structured educational setting, I don't see why it wouldn't show gains. I think you can always, as you said, Rick, you can always find someone that will find somewhere that, they didn't quite gain. Then the question is, what are they comparing it to? What are those gains in relation to? So, it's since, generally speaking, more is better. And then better than more would be a little bit different, I guess you could say. But first would be more. Right, Sean? Oh, I'm
right.
sorry.
No, that's a good point. That's a motto to live by.
We're going to make T-shirts.
Right. I think the article does bring up. I sort of zeroed in on that too, Rick, in sort of the point and then counterpoint format. That a lot of newspaper articles are written. And the one thing that I hear just in popular culture media when they talk about whether or not to extend the school day or to offer extended or year-long kindergarten is the idea that in some studies the gains have not lasted after kindergarten. And at least to me, I take that as meaning that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater and saying that, well, we need to get rid of all-day kindergarten or all-year kindergarten. To me, that means that even though this can help, all-year kindergarten isn't a silver bullet. Like if you attend kindergarten all year long and then don't go to school for 5 years, you those gains shouldn't last. So it isn't this magical elixir. But I think probably what the evidence does show pretty clearly is that if you have high quality year-long kindergarten and you get some help in the remaining elementary years and through middle school, is that your probability for future success can only increase.
Mm-hmm. My first reaction was, wait a minute, there's some places where kindergarten isn't a full day.
That surprised me too.
That was news to me. When I was a kid, I only went to kindergarten for half a day, but I thought that was almost 30 years ago. And so I thought, they kind of adjusted things based on that. But it depends on so many things. And like Sean was saying, there's just because you attend kindergarten all day doesn't necessarily mean that you're good to go. I had a lot of parents. I have a lot of first graders that I'm working with where either the teacher was more focused on finger painting and all that fun stuff and not so much about, reading and early reading strategies and numeracy, stuff like that. And then I also had, on the other hand, I had a lot of parents who were like, I didn't do the homework or didn't work with them on letter sounds because I'm thinking they're 5 and this is kindergarten. Kindergarten should be about finger painting. So I think that, either one of those scenarios aren't really going to set the child up for really, that extra benefit for a full day classroom or a full day kindergarten class. And additionally, I think with the Common Core standards, now that most states have accepted them, at least in Florida, which maybe he isn't saying a whole lot, but these standards are much more rigorous, and students are expected to do a lot more earlier. So I really don't think that kindergartners in Florida really have time to finger paint. They need to learn their letter sounds and letter names and numbers and counting with tangibles and all that good stuff. So a full day to do all that to meet these standards seems to be necessary.
Which leads me into my issue that I always have when I see full day kindergarten, extended school year. People just look at the time element very uncritically. In our field of precision teaching, we have timing and measurement truly down to a science. And if you could just give me 10 minutes, 5 minutes out of an instructional session and allow me to do some practice, allow me to time the students, allow me to measure their performance. If those students aren't doing well on our daily charts, then we'll make a change and we'll try something different. That, if people could do that in a full day kindergarten, problem solved. Mm-hmm. You would have reading, advanced reading, math, students who were struggling, all of that would be greatly improved. And not only that, because you're charting, you would have records on all of the students, intensive records. And that's something that I wish people who are policymakers would look into. That it's not just, okay, well, we're going to have these kids for a full day, because if that full day consists of finger painting, recess, people just working on cooperation, while those aren't unimportant, if you are trying to meet the Common Core standards, you have to be looking at how can I squeeze the most out of that instructional time. And just because you time kids and they practice, that's not bringing back drill and kill, and it's not giving worksheets to kids who are in kindergarten and strapping them to their desks and all those pictures that people try to say, oh, practice is bad, it's evil, blah, blah, blah. So I hope that if people do start considering, and if it's mandated that we go to full day kindergarten, that the research looks at what are you doing with that time? And of course, the precision teaching angle, which we all understand and support and hope other people would learn and pay attention to, would be something considered.
Rick, what you just said was the different that I talked about. You just did it a lot more eloquently.
With that full day kindergarten story, we have another science news story, which has to do with academics. And this article is a very technical article because it deals with brain science. And the article's title is Quality of White Matter in the Brain is Crucial for Adding and Multiplying. This study comes from, let's see, where was this thing published at?
Neurology.
Yeah, Neurology. Needless to say, I shouldn't speak for everyone here, but Neurology isn't a journal that I typically read.
No, yeah, you can speak for me on that one.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
This is what the brain science in neurology is only going to get more as our technology increases. This is only going to get more prominent. And it's interesting the things that they're finding. This study looked at healthy kids, or typically developing, and they were from, where are they from? From Denmark. And they looked at these students conducting I don't know if it's basic operations. I read the article and they said operations, but the operations went from simple to more complex. They gave them a minute to do it, but I wonder if they had more than just single, for example, addition. They didn't say if it went from single-digit addition to more complex addition. So I wasn't clear on that from the article.
Rick, did the article say anything about the subject's performance with adding and multiplying, comparison, subtracting, dividing? Do they have higher frequencies with addition and multiplying as opposed to subtraction, dividing, or different accuracies? I mean, really more important, I'm really interested in frequencies, but do they mention their performance on those skills specifically?
They do. The one thing, they're actually similar. All of the results were somewhat similar. My question was, I don't know if they were measuring problems, if that's what they were scoring, or if they were scoring the more sensitive digits as we do. For example, in addition, the mean was 31. For subtraction, the mean was 28. For multiplication, it was 27. And for division, it was 27. Those are all pretty closely bunched up together.
27 what? They don't specify that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Is that 27 digits or 27 problems?
Right.
27 items.
27 items.
The maximum score for each subtest was 40, and there were 40 items.
So then that's probably not digits.
No.
Right.
It's not digits. It's considered elementary computations. Only one arithmetic operation per subtest. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. And they're of increasing difficulty.
Unless that means they started off with easy sums, like 1, 2, 3, and then they get up to 4 or 5, and the n is 8 and 9.
Yeah.
But if that's the case, then that would mean if they had 31 items, you figure that would probably translate to, 40, 45 digits per minute?
Which is not fluent.
No, that's
not at all.
They have it all on subtraction. They have addition, subtraction, multiplication. They have scores for division. Yeah, so it ranged from 31 correct addition to 27 correct division and multiplication. So they weren't even getting to half of them. They were getting to they weren't getting 75% of them. Problems.
Yeah. It's not. These students were 12 years old. So that means, let's see, 12 years old. What is that, 5th grade?
It's 7th, because 11-year-olds are in 6th grade, so 12-year-olds 7th, yeah.
Okay. If these are 7th graders,
you're right.
and they are at halfway to the aim, what does that say about?
Right.
Well, any rate, what I found interesting about this is they did neuroimaging with these students. And this is something that, as a precision teacher and someone who's interested in fluency, I find this fascinating. So let's just talk about some basic brain science, some brain science 101. When you consider actions or you think about actions, those are the result of these electrical impulses that go down these chains of nerve fibers. So our brains, in essence, are these bundles of all these, people talk about wires. So these fibers or wires, there's billions of these wires, which are neurons, and they're connected to each other by synapses. So anytime whenever you do something, your brain sends a signal through those chains of those nerve fibers to your muscles. Now, when you practice, there's something called myelin. And myelin wraps around those fibers. And the more myelin that you have, and by the way, the myelin is the white matter, the more of that you have, the faster that's going to fire. And that's where our practice comes in. And I find it fascinating in these articles where what they're doing is they're showing that through fMRI.
So would this summation be let me know if I'm on the right page here. The closer you get to fluency, the more white matter would be detected through an fMRI.
The more fluent you become, the more
Right.
white matter you would have. What they did is they looked at specific regions that corresponded to these operations that they were giving.
Mm-hmm. I'm just baffled at why is there a difference between adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing.
Yes.
I'm just stumped.
What they found in this article is they saw the white matter and they could associate that with the addition and the multiplication, but not the same thing for the subtraction and division.
Right. And if they were, and at first, without knowing their performance on these skills, I was thinking just with my observation with students in their assessment, they're always better at adding than they are subtracting. They're always better at multiplying than they are with dividing. And by better, I mean faster. Not necessarily accurate. They can be accurate across the board, but they are faster at adding and multiplying than subtracting and dividing. So then I was thinking maybe this fMRI, the white matter, is actually measuring, like a fluency outcome. They're greater white matter because these children are faster at adding and multiplying. But you're saying that that's not the case, that they were performing at the same speed pretty much across all 4 domains. So I just don't know how, because addition is the same thing as subtraction. Fundamentally, they're the same thing. One's going forwards and the other one's going backwards. It's just, you're adding negative numbers with subtraction. And so I don't know.
No, I just don't know enough about these specific regions to answer that question, and I don't know, in the article what explains that difference, other than it exists.
Right. Well, this paragraph, I actually wanted to jump on Facebook and talk about this one paragraph, and I was like, oh no, spoiler alert! But here in this in the summary article, not in the main article published, but in this summary, it says a possible explanation for this meaning distinction, I imagine, is that this white matter bundle is involved in rote memorization, whereas when we subtract and divide, such memorization plays less of a role. When subtracting and dividing, we are more likely to use intermediary steps to calculate the solution, even as adults. What? I don't.
Right.
So this is saying, okay, we're fluent with adding and multiplying, but we're not fluent with subtracting and dividing. Even as adults, people suck at subtracting and dividing. That's kind of and I think that is, so then that's kind of, again, led me to my little thought that really these participants just were not fluent at subtracting and dividing.
That's true. Looking at the numbers, clearly they're not fluent in any of these.
Yeah.
What's cool, though, is now people who are in the field looking at how fluency could have impact, there's just a whole area that can open up.
That's true.
And I get excited about that. I put in a grant with a colleague, and my colleague knows a heck of a lot more about brain scans and this than I do. And it'll be interesting to see through working with her, what do we discover? Because this study is a descriptive study and they're finding out some interesting information, but just think what happens. The fluency standards that are used in precision teaching are incredibly high. And those, when you get long-term retention because of all the practice that's put in there, and it's not just it's distributed practice. It's distributed across time. It's high quality practice. So you have these learners that are practicing at a high level for a good period of time. And I think when the verdict comes in and people see what true behavioral fluency is about, I think that's a way that people are really going to take notice. I don't know what those scans are going to show, but I'm excited about it.
Yeah, these are one-shot deals. If you read, it was one picture, and there's no comparison. There's no checking over time. There's no even comparing from one to the other. Now, they didn't ask that question. All they did was determine correlation, which is a relationship, but some interesting things, and it serves as groundwork for the next stages, like you mentioned, Rick.
Let's move on to our interview.
I would like to welcome Dr. Charles Hughes to the Precision Teaching Podcast. Charlie, welcome.
Well, thanks, Rick. Glad to be here.
Charlie is a colleague of mine. He is a professor at Penn State University, and Charlie is well known in the field for a few things. One of the things that he's done is something called learning strategies. And the other thing that he's done a lot of work in and research is explicit instruction. And of course, there's other things that he's done that we could talk about, but those are the two main things that we're going to talk to Charlie today about. Charlie, I'd like to ask you first, how did you get into the field?
Basically through the swimming pool, I guess. Very briefly, you have to be careful, Rick, about asking older people to talk about their younger days, but I'll try to make this brief, and that is when I was 19, I was running a swimming pool as a lifeguard and swim instructor, and I was approached by the Red Cross in Northern California and asked if I would be interested in helping them start a swimming program for individuals with disabilities, physical as well as intellectual. And being young and ignorant, I said, sure, why not? And I got interested in that way. And also, one time when I was teaching a life-saving class, one of my prospective lifeguards who really wanted to be a lifeguard and was very good in the pool activities. And at the end of the course, you have to take a written exam, and he failed it. And I was really very surprised. Now, remember, this is 1969, and I came to find out that he couldn't read, and therefore he failed the written test. But because he was so good and he just really wanted to be a lifeguard, I went to the Red Cross again and said, look, couldn't this individual take the test, have it read to him, because we're assessing his knowledge of the information, not his reading abilities. And they thought about it, and actually that turned out to be one of the first accommodations. So anyway, I had that experience, and then a little bit later on, I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnamese War, and I had to pick place to do 2 years of alternative service, and one of the options was to work with individuals with disabilities, and as they say, the rest is history.
You were a teacher for a number of years, so you went to college, and then did you attain your master's degree and then started teaching, or how did that work?
Well, I started out with my alternate service teaching for 2 years. Basically not really knowing what I was doing, and because of that, I started a master's program in Kentucky and would teach during the day and then take classes at night. And so I finally wound up getting my master's in special education, and then after that became a certified teacher and taught a number of years in Louisville, Kentucky, as well as in Charlotte, as well as in northern Florida.
How would you taught in, let's see, that would be the 70s when you were teaching?
Yeah, my first year was 1971 as a classroom teacher.
That means you were in, I guess you could say that formally at least, that was the genesis of special education, because the public law came into effect shortly after that. what was it like in terms of the understanding of how to instruct students at that point in time?
Oh, I guess it's kind of the dark ages. To be quite honest, in 1971, many students were still excluded from public schools because that was pre-PL 94-142. But as PL 94-142 kicked in and more students were being served by the public schools, I'll be quite honest with you, in many areas of disability instruction, most of us didn't know what we were doing. And we, that was the era of a lot of process interventions and vestibular stimulation, and just dominant delicato were there. I mean, it was really a mix, and teachers really had no evidence-based guidance, and I'd say that's the biggest difference between now and when I started, is we really were reaching in the dark, literally, about what to do and what was effective. Probably, I'd say the first program that I felt was pretty effective were the direct instruction curricula that came out of Zig's shop in the mid-'70s.
So you were a teacher for a number of years, and you decide to go back and get your doctorate at it's Florida, University of Florida.
Yep.
And you worked for a few years, and I looked over your very impressive vita, and I saw too that part of your work is you had a chance to bump into some precision teachers. You had some behavioral colleagues. You had you had a very interesting group of people that were guiding you. What was that like at the time when you were a graduate student?
Well, I was lucky enough to be hired at a university-based project, which included neurologists and school psychology and speech communication. And we also had a clinic. And that clinic was run by Dr. Cecil Mercer, who became my advisor in my doctoral program. And the clinic was pretty much a hotbed of precision teaching. I'd never really been around it very much, but all the kids were assessed using precision teaching measures. We would develop interventions for them from a multidisciplinary approach, and then measure progress using precision teaching and the charts. And I even took a graduate course from a fellow named Bill Walking at Florida. So I kind of became immersed for several years with that, and really came to see the value of that type of measurement and precision.
Then you graduate, and you've had a very distinguished career. I'd like for you to talk to our audience about each big chunks of the things that you've done research with. And first, I'd like to ask you about learning strategies. How would you describe that to someone that hasn't heard about it before? So give us the basic description of what learning strategies are.
Sure. And that's a term that's used a lot and used different ways, learning strategies. But what I became interested in is much of my teaching was with adolescents with learning and behavior problems. And I really floundered as a teacher about what to teach them. And so I would be working on improving their academic skills, but a lot of these kids were starting to begin to spend more and more of their day in general education classrooms. And while certainly there was a rationale for improving basic reading skills, they were also expected to survive in the general education setting. And when I was at Florida, I started reading the literature about adolescents with learning disabilities and the fact that they were not particularly independent, strategic learners. That is, they didn't have all the strategies that good learners have about how to study, reading comprehension strategies, test-taking strategies, and so on. And so I became pretty immersed in that literature. And then when I started my career, actually began working with the University of Kansas Center for Research and Learning, which is the longest continuing center on studying students with adolescents with learning disabilities, more learning disabilities in general, actually. And with them developed a number of the learning strategies that they have in their SIM curriculum. I don't know, maybe some of the listeners have heard of SIM, the strategic instruction model. And so my love has always been classroom-based instruction, and I really felt like these learning strategies were really helping kids become more independent learners, which is really the goal for all of our kids, actually.
When you look at across all of the different learning strategies that have been developed, what do you see as some of the most effective?
Well, for me, there's a lot of things that go into a learning strategy. I would characterize most of these learning strategies as what I call task-specific learning strategies. That is, they are a series of steps kids learn to follow that will help them solve a problem or complete a task. And strategies should be well designed in terms of how much information they chunk into each step the child is to follow. You can have a very complex strategy, so it may be well designed, but it's not very efficient. So there's a balance between making a strategy efficient as well as effective. But what I started coming down to is that you can design a very well design strategy or instructional sequence for pretty much anything, but if you don't teach it well, it really doesn't make any difference. So I started moving more towards how you teach these types of things as much as I was in what these strategies are. And that also led me into things such as explicit instruction and the book that Anita Archer and I published a little while back.
How are learning strategies different from mnemonics?
Well, yeah. A mnemonic essentially means memory. So a mnemonic device is something that is specifically designed to help you remember something. Now, some people confuse the term mnemonic with these strategies because that series of steps that I talked about, when they design strategies, they usually make the first letter form a first mnemonic strategy to help the kids remember the steps. So the strategies contain a mnemonic device to help the kids remember the steps they should take, but it's not a mnemonic. They just incorporate mnemonics into the strategy development. So you can have one of my strategies is the test-taking strategy, and we created a series of steps in a way that made the first letter of each step form the word pirates, so that the kids would remember that. And a lot of the teachers started, when they were working with kids, would call them, say, we're going to become our point pirates, and we're going to steal every point we can on our tests. Or they got pretty creative. Yeah. So that's essentially, I think, the difference.
Some of the listeners in our podcast became inspired and said, wow, you know what? I haven't known a lot about learning strategies, but they make sense. I'd like to do them. How would they get into that? Is there enough information that someone could read a book and then just start making learning strategies? Should they buy pre-packaged materials? How would people go forward and get more information and think about using this? Well,
yeah, that's a great question. I think that teachers are certainly capable of developing their own strategies. I think they're, as most things, it's a little bit more complex than just writing down a series of steps and turning them into a first letter mnemonic. I'm not. If somebody could access, if they want to do a quick read, I did an article in a publication called Focus on Exceptional Children, and it came out in 2011. And what I tried to do anyway, is to do a fairly easy to read summary of what are learning strategies, how are they developed, what goes into them, and then a fair amount on the instructional procedures that are used to teach them so the kids actually acquire them, generalize their use, and so on and so forth. I would say I would recommend that if they can track down that in Focus on Exceptional Children, that would be something they could read in 30 minutes. They can get a good quick overview, and then the sources that are in the reference section, if they wanted to go from there, and get deeper and deeper into it, I would say, most of the references in that article would lead them. And they can also go to KUCRL.com, which is the University of Kansas website.
That's great. I'll make sure, I'll see, number one, if I can download that article, and I'll put it up in our show notes so that everyone can access that. And I'll also put a link to the website that you just shared.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
So with learning strategies, one last question. If we're looking at students, and I suppose learning strategies aren't specific to a grade level. So if you're working with a student with a disability, it could be any disability, you would have your choice of, well, I should say, where would people have their choice of figuring out if you're working with students with learning disabilities who are younger versus maybe you have some students with autism who are a little bit older, how would people access what's out there and what are the different learning strategies that they can choose from that have been developed? Yeah.
As I mentioned, the center that I work with has had a focus on adolescence. And so the learning strategies they develop are typically fairly complex. They involve some language skills as a prerequisite. I would say probably a student would need to read around the maybe the third or fourth grade level in order to benefit from these types of strategies. However, as those started getting more and more out in the schools, people were saying, well, what about younger kids? What about kids who are lower functioning? And so on. And so there has been work in making these strategies a little bit more accessible to lower functioning students or younger students. And actually in that article that I mentioned, I do talk about the ways that what people can do to make strategies more accessible for younger kids. Also, again, very brief overview about the things, but the references in the article can lead people to more references about that. But I must say, one of my recent strategies was on writing essays, and did the initial research with students with learning disabilities at the middle school. And but some people at the University of Iowa got a hold of it, and they have been teaching students who are, I don't know, for lack of a better term, more intellectually lower functioning, and it simplified the strategy in some of the ways that I was talking about in my other article, and got great results, for these students. And another strategy that we developed was used with third and fourth graders. And again, we did a few tweaks on the strategy, and they did very well too.
That's great. I'll be able to share some of that information, and our readers or our listeners will be able to access that information then from your article. Let's switch gears and talk about explicit instruction. Explicit instruction is something that some people may have heard about. Hopefully everyone's heard about it, but some people may have not have heard of exactly that term. And we can literally say that you've written a book on it. Why don't you tell us about what is explicit instruction?
Well, to some extent, explicit instruction has been around, or certain elements or aspects of it, for 100, 200 years. It's really a general approach to teaching academics especially for students who need more support than others. But there's nothing that we particularly invented, and some of these elements have been around for forever. People who are familiar with the concept of direct instruction, it is very similar to that. We have more elements related to the delivery of instruction that are involved in it. But essentially, it's a very direct, explicit, organized way of teaching kids who are struggling maybe with attention problems or background knowledge or whatever to help them acquire, maintain, and generalize academic skills. It can be used very flexibly, but it's that model. If you take a look at a prototypical explicit lesson, you would see the teacher start out by making sure that all students are attending to the right stimuli, ready to roll, they're not distracted. You might have, depending on who you're teaching and what you're teaching, you might have some discussion about why it's important to learn what they're going to learn in the lesson and where they might use it and how it links up to things that they learned before. And also to make sure that before you start teaching that they have the prerequisite skills and knowledge. And then once you're into the instructional part of a typical lesson, you start out with a very clear model, demonstration, call it a think aloud if you want to call it that. But essentially it's a description and physical model of what you want them to learn, followed by supported practice. One of the key aspects underlying explicit instruction is that students will make mistakes, but we want them to have a high rate of responding with a relatively low rate of errors. So errors are part of learning, but if you have too many, it really decreases how fast they can learn and how efficiently they will learn. And then once they have shown, then there's a gradual fading of the supports or scaffold, followed by practice, and then followed by distributed practice after that with lots of feedback and monitoring. So, in a nutshell, those are the types of things you would see in an explicit lesson. And those are the primary elements that are involved in explicit instruction, along with getting lots and lots and lots of student responses, and then monitoring those responses very closely and giving students both affirmative as well as corrective feedback, and taking that information they're getting from all these student responses and making adaptations to the lesson. And, one of the things we say that this type of approach is sometimes characterized as teacher-centered, but we like to look at it as student-centered because every decision is made upon student responses. So they're really the ones that are giving the teacher feedback about how well they're teaching.
What is the difference between teacher-centered and student-centered? When people use those terms, what do they mean by that?
Well, most of the time, if you read those things, there's all these catchy phrases out there in education land. And so student-centered means that essentially the student should lead and be in charge of their own learning. And people who are proponents of that type of thing, which is pretty much a pure discovery type of approach, is that the teacher is the guide on the side. Mm-hmm. And then when you get into teacher-centered, that is more depending on who's characterizing it. It's like the teacher is telling everybody what to do. And therefore, it's very teacher-centered. The teacher chooses what is to be learned, how it's presented in practice, and so on. So it's really gets back to like the reading wars, and some people say kids should learn through discovery. Some kids should learn through more guided types of things. And to me, it's sometimes a false distinction. I think how you teach or the method you use should depend on the student, your philosophy, and it depends on what the student knows and what you're trying to teach them. And there are some kids who don't need a lot of guidance, and there are some kids who need a lot of guidance. So, but that's kind of, I think, to me, the basics of those terms.
Do we have evidence that shows explicit instruction is something that most teachers, all teachers should be doing, as opposed to more student-centered discovery type of orientations?
There's a really good book that I like. It's by a fellow named John Hattie. He's an Australian, and it's called Visible Learning. And if your listeners are familiar with meta-analyses, that means you take a group of studies on the same thing and then you quantify the effects of this intervention on over all these studies. This gentleman did a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. So he's got 18,000 studies that he looked at in terms of instructional procedures. And just beginning with his book, direct instruction has a very large effect size. Discovery learning has a very low effect size. Things like whole language, which is pretty much a discovery constructivist approach, has a very low effect size. That means it doesn't affect learning very much. And then, when we wrote this book, we went back and we looked at research over the last 50 years related to instructional approach and teacher behaviors. What do teachers do that help students learn, with an eye on students with learning problems? But what we found was there's a lot of research on teaching with students without learning problems that shows that overall an explicit, organized, direct approach involving lots of responses, involving lots of timely feedback and so on, is a very, very effective way to teach academic skills, concepts, and so on. So to me, it came down to 50 years of research done by a lot of different people, done on a lot of different kids, and coming from general education, special education, cognitive psychology. It's just this huge convergence of research that shows that this is a very powerful tool that all teachers should have in their toolbox.
You have been around education quite a while, and you've had a chance to see special ed and general ed. What's your sense of how popular is explicit instruction?
It's the old pendulum swing, I think. I think we're getting to a point now where more teachers, more administrators are seeing the value of having a more structured approach to instruction, and just a pure discovery type of approach probably isn't getting the results. Unfortunately, part of that is, I don't know if it's unfortunate or not, I'll take what we can get, but is this era of testing, and they're seeing that kids are just doing terribly. And so their administrators and people at the state level are looking around for, how can we help our kids learn? And so I think they're starting to look at more evidence-based types of approaches to teaching, rather than approaches that are based on, unexamined theory or even a social philosophy of how life should be or whatever. So, there are forces, I think, that are making people take a closer look. My goal is that the pendulum doesn't swing as wide as it used to be, because, to be honest, I think that there is much to learn from guided discovery approaches. So I don't want to throw any babies out with the bathwater, but I think it's going back towards, I don't want to say basics, because it's not really basics, but I think it's going back to more evidence-based, more sensible instructional approaches. I know that our book, and I'm not pushing this book or anything like that, but we've sold over 60,000 copies in about 2.5 years, and the vast majority are general education teachers in the field that are using them.
Well, you are a humble person, so I'll plug your book for you. There's a copy that I purchased. A number of my colleagues have it on their bookshelves, and we'll have a link to purchasing that book because it is a very clean, clear description of not only what is, but how to implement direct instruction. And that was written by yourself and your colleague, Anita Archer, both very well-established people in the field who just
otherwise known as old, but thank you. But no, thank you. I appreciate that.
Let me ask you about the span of explicit instruction. Can it be done across all grades? For example, could you do it in preschool up to college, or is it more specific to a certain grade level?
My attitude is that the general principles and elements of explicit instruction can be used to teach anybody at any age level, as long as you're teaching them how to do something or maybe even what something is. My attitude is one of the things that I hear a lot in education is this concept of differentiation. And I've even heard more poetic versions like children are like snowflakes. Every one of them is different. And so that you have to teach kids differently and all that. I agree that no child is the same, but I also believe that we are an organism and a species, and in general, we learn the same way. Now, how that looks may be different. You know, what is reinforcing for one person may be different from another, and they may have got that through a different learning history and all that, but the principle remains the same. Reinforcement is something that affects human behavior. And in terms of learning and what we're learning more and more about the brain, and I'm not talking about brain-based education, I'm talking about how the brain actually functions, we are more similar than we are different. And the reason I bring that up is that every individual, if they're going to learn something, could benefit from a clear demonstration or model of what that is. Now, how I might model or what I might model might be different for a 3-year-old than it is for a college student, but nonetheless, they will all benefit from a good, clear, concise, and consistent demonstration or model or think aloud. All students, every human being benefits from feedback. Now, the nature of that feedback, how it's said, the language that is used, the timing of it, to some extent will vary, but the principle remains the same. Everybody needs feedback. Our organism, even though our organism doesn't like to practice, in order to retain something and to generalize it, you need to practice it. You need to become automatic and fluid, something I'm sure that you and your audience know a lot more about than I do. So my main point here is yes, I think the general principles of learning are the same across our species and whatever age. It's just how it might look and what we teach will be different. Does that make sense?
Yes, perfect sense.
Oh, good.
Well,
I can never tell.
The interviewer is just supposed to nod silently and ask questions.
Okay.
We're towards the end of our interview. Were there any questions that I could have asked you that I didn't cover, or any final comments or thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience?
I do know the research on lectures, and that after about 20 to 30 minutes, you lose your audience. So it might be a good idea just to cut it right here. But just that I don't know who exactly your audience is. I suspect they're parents. There's some teachers. But I can tell you that a lot of things impact how well students learn. It's a complex formula to figure it out. But one thing we do know is that the teacher or the parent can have a large impact on predicting how well students will learn and fare later on in their life. So I think we have a big responsibility. We can't, blame poverty, not to, to full extent, but teachers can and parents can make a difference with their kids.
What a wonderful way to end the show. Well, Charlie, on behalf of my audience, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day and joining us on the Precision Teaching Podcast.
Well, very glad to do it, Rick.
Well, that brings us to the end of our show. Sean, Doug, Carrie, any parting words or closing comments?
I was going to say more is better and then difference better than more.
And I say wait for the t-shirt. It's coming out.
There you go.
I can't follow that up, Doug.
Well, there you go.
Well done. On behalf of Doug Kostowitz, Carrie Milico, and Sean Datchick, I'm Rick Cabina, and thank you for listening to the Precision Teaching Podcast.